first heard her voice in a half-empty cafe, the kind of place that smelled faintly of old books and coffee grounds that had soaked into the wooden floorboard. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the table. I was sitting alone, reading a tattered notebook, when I noticed her at the far corner, knees drawn to her chest, hands trembling over a cup of tea. She wasn't trying to be seen, yet there was something about the way her shoulders slumped that made her impossible to ignore. "Todo mundo sempre vai embora," she whispered, almost like she was afraid the words might echo back and leave her behind. "Everyone always leaves," she said without looking at her. Her voice was soft, almost brittle, but the weight of it settled in, pulling the quiet air into her gravity. I didn't move for a moment, unsure whether to speak or pretend I hadn't heard, but some impulse, not urgent or loud, told me that leaving her alone wouldn't be the right answer. I lowered my book slowly and said, "I'm not everyone." The words left my mouth before I could question whether they were right, whether they might be dismissed or laughed off. They simply existed. She lifted her eyes then, just enough to catch mine. Her gaze was hesitant, a mixture of surprise and caution, as though she had been waiting for someone to say something like that, and had never actually believed it would happen. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the silence between us thick with unspoken history. I didn't move closer. I didn't offer my hand or a smile. There was no urgency, no desperate attempt to fill a void she hadn't even named yet. I just stayed, a quiet presence across the table, letting her measure me in her own way, letting her decide what this small moment meant. I didn't mean to say that out loud," she murmured, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She kept her hands wrapped tightly around the cup, as if it could somehow anchor her to the present. "It's okay," I said, voice calm, even. "It makes sense. You're allowed to feel it." She shook her head, a faint, tired motion. "You don't get it. People, they just leave. They always leave." "I'm not one of them," I repeated softly. No grand promises, no declarations that might scare her off, just the certainty that I wasn't going anywhere in that moment. That's all I could offer. But sometimes, I thought, that might be enough. She exhaled slowly, almost like a sigh escaping from deep within her chest. The tension in her hands eased just a fraction. Her eyes softened, and though she didn't speak again, the subtle shift in her posture told me she noticed me. She noticed I wasn't just another person passing through. We stayed like that for a while. She stared at her tea, her mind somewhere distant, and I kept my notebook open but unread, pretending to write while actually observing her. It was delicate, this early stage of presence, when words were dangerous, and silence was safer. I didn't need her to trust me. I only needed her to see that I could be here, quietly, steadily. Outside, the streetlights flickered, and a breeze pushed through the half-open door. She shivered slightly, and without thinking, I pushed my coat a little closer to her side of the bench, not touching her, not invading, just offering what could be a small comfort. She looked up, almost startled, and I gave her the smallest nod. That was all, a simple gesture. For the first time since she had muttered those words, there was a faint tremor of something else in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe a fragile hope. And I knew, even if she couldn't say it yet, that this was the beginning. Something had started between us, quiet and careful, but undeniable. After that night in the cafe, I didn't expect her to reach out, and yet she did. A message appeared on my phone the next afternoon. "I don't know why I'm doing this, but do you want to meet?" There was no punctuation, no explanation, just an invitation wrapped in uncertainty. I replied simply, "I'll be there." No questions, no insistence, just presence, because that had been the beginning of what mattered. When I arrived, she was sitting on the low stone wall outside a small bookstore, knees tucked close, her scarf slipping over her shoulder. The air carried the soft scent of rain from earlier in the kind that makes the world feel clean and fragile at the same time. I didn't sit too close, didn't rush to fill the space between us. I simply lowered myself beside her, letting the silence have its own. "You came," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Not a question, more like a statement that she needed to test if the world still kept promises. "I did," I said, and that was enough. I didn't elaborate. Words felt too heavy for what this was. Two people existing in the same small world without pressure, without expectation. We walked slowly along the cobblestone street, neither of us speaking much. She kept glancing at me, her eyes darting away when she realized I noticed. I understood that look. It was curiosity coated in caution. She was assessing, always assessing, as if measuring whether staying close was safe, and I was patient. I had nowhere urgent to be. There was no reason to force trust. It had to arrive on its own. At one corner, she paused to watch a street musician playing a violin. The notes were soft, almost hesitant, but they lingered in the spaces between our steps. She exhaled, a little laugh escaping her lips. Not at me, not at the music, but at the sudden recognition that she could, for a moment, feel something other than fear. I didn't say anything. I just let her laugh continue, a subtle echo in the quiet of that small street. When she finally spoke, it was about something trivial. How the bookstore always rearranged its window. How the cafe down the block burned the bread a little too dark. How the rain left tiny pools along the curb. Her words weren't really about those things. They were about letting someone in slowly, testing whether the ordinary could feel safe in presence. I listened, asked small questions, and never interrupted. Hours passed. I noticed the way her hands relaxed around the strap of her bag, how her shoulders softened, how she allowed herself to look at the world instead of just defending against it. I didn't offer advice. I didn't suggest solutions. I simply walked beside her, a constant in a life that had probably known little of that. At the edge of the park, she stopped, watching a group of children chase a loose dog. Her expression softened in a way that was rare, unguarded, not trying to measure what she could or couldn't expect. I don't usually do this, she admitted, almost shyly. I don't usually just stay. You don't have to, I said. But you did. She glanced at me, eyes wide, lips parting in a hesitant smile. No words followed, because none were necessary. Something had shifted in the quiet spaces we shared, something more significant than explanations, more enduring than promises. The hours we spent together, unremarkable to anyone watching, became a subtle foundation, a testament to the possibility of presence, patience, and the beginnings of trust. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky with muted oranges and purples, I realized that the ordinary, when shared carefully, could hold more meaning than any grand gesture. She might never know how much I appreciated just being there, and I knew she was beginning, slowly, to see that I wasn't going anywhere. A few days later, we found ourselves sitting on a bench near the river, watching the water drift lazily past the stone edges. She had that look again, the one that belonged to someone who had carried too much. Someone weighed down by the expectations and disappointments of others. I didn't ask questions, didn't probe. I only watched, and when she noticed, she didn't look away immediately. There was a quiet acknowledgement in that shared gaze, a recognition that sometimes being seen was a gift on its own. I hate how everyone has an opinion, she said suddenly, voice low. Family, friends, even strangers. Everyone wants something from you, but no one ever really asks if you're okay. Her hands fidgeted with the zipper of her jacket, pulling at it almost absent-mindedly. I could tell she had rehearsed saying this to herself 1,000 times before, maybe never aloud. I get it, I said. It's exhausting when the world acts like your life should fit into a box someone else built. I didn't need to offer solutions or advice. That wasn't my place. My role was simpler, to sit, to notice, to let her speak without interference. She exhaled sharply, then laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carries a little frustration and a little relief all at once. You make it sound easy, she murmured, eyes tracing the ripples in the water. Like being ignored by chaos is natural or something. It's not natural. It's a choice, but it's one I make, quietly. I paused, letting her process that. I choose to be present, even when the world isn't. Her eyes softened. I could see the tension in her shoulders loosen, a subtle shift in posture that spoke louder than. For a moment, the only sound was the water moving over stone, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. She was starting to realize that presence didn't need to come with strings, that some people stayed not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I've been hurt, she confessed, voice trembling. Not in big, dramatic ways, just enough. Enough to make me careful, to make me wonder if anyone actually stays. Her gaze dropped to her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, and I didn't reach for them. I didn't need to. My attention alone was the anchor she hadn't yet admitted she needed. Being careful isn't bad. It just means you've learned something. You're not broken, just cautious. That's reasonable. She looked up at me, really looked, for longer than before. There was a flicker of something. Trust, maybe, or the curiosity that comes when someone dares to break your assumptions about people. And you, why are you still here? She asked quietly. Because I'm not everyone, I replied. And because I think you deserve someone who just stays, not for a reason beyond being here, but because it's enough to be present. She didn't speak for a while after that. She just nodded, slowly, as if understanding was arriving in layers. I stayed silent, feeling that quiet gravity settle between us. It wasn't a grand gesture or a revelation. It was the simplicity of noticing someone without expecting them to change or prove themselves. It was sitting through the mess of others, opinions, pressures, small betrayal, and offering, without fanfare, an anchor. The sun dipped lower, turning the river gold. She shifted slightly, closer than before, not touching, just existing in the same rhythm of space. I realized then that trust didn't need fireworks or announcements. It could arrive in fragments, in long afternoons like this. In the simple decision to stay when leaving was easier, and somehow, She was beginning to understand that I had no intention of leaving. A week later, I found myself waiting outside her apartment, unsure if she would come out or retreat again. The message I had received earlier was short, almost clipped. I need some space. Don't come. Her words were a wall, polite but firm, and I knew better than to climb it. I stayed at a distance, leaning against the cold metal railing of the fire escape stairs, letting the night stretch between us. Hours passed. The streetlights flickered, and the hum of distant traffic filled the silence. I didn't try to call, didn't send another message. My presence was not about convincing her to stay. It was about being ready for when she decided she could. Presence, not pressure, was the only promise I intended to keep. When she finally appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a scarf too thin for the chill, I noticed the subtle signs of her indecision, the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she paused, as if testing whether I was still here. She didn't speak immediately, only stepped onto the sidewalk, weighing her next move. You waited, she said finally, voice tight but not accusatory. I did, I said. I'm not in a hurry. Take all the time you need. Her gaze softened for the first time that evening, a flicker of relief passing across her features. It was clear she had expected me to react differently, to leave, to insist, to argue, but none of that happened. I simply stayed, quietly, without expectation. That stillness spoke louder than any words I might have used. We began to walk, our steps slow, measured, almost tentative. The street around us was deserted, lit only by the amber glow of streetlights. I could feel her tension easing, not fully, but enough to notice it. She glanced at me, almost shyly, as if testing whether the space between us could be safe. I'm sorry, she muttered after a long pause. I shouldn't have. You don't need to apologize, interrupted gently. Everyone has moments when they feel like running. You're allowed that. She swallowed, and I saw the faintest trace of a smile. Most people, she said quietly. I'm not most people. Her laugh was small, almost nervous, but it carried something else too. A recognition that someone could offer consistency without demand. For the first time, I felt her hand brush against mine, not intentionally, just a fleeting, accidental touch that lingered in a way that mattered more than deliberate gestures ever could. We continued walking, neither speaking much. The air was filled with the quiet hum of the city, but between us, something else had taken shape, a fragile trust, fragile but present, that she could lean into without fear. I didn't force her to say more, didn't prod for explanations or reasons. It was enough to simply walk beside her, steady and unwavering. By the time we returned to her building, the space between us had shifted. She looked at me, truly looked, as if measuring not just my presence but my intent. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence carried the message. I was here, and I would remain. And for the first time that evening, I saw her let go of some of the weight she had been carrying, if only slightly, trusting that not everyone leaves. It started with a coffee, or maybe two. There was no particular reason for meeting that, no plans, no occasion, just the quiet understanding that we were both free in that. She arrived wearing a jacket that smelled faintly of rain, carrying a bag that looked heavier than it should have been. I noticed the subtle slump in her shoulders as she scanned the cafe, her eyes briefly meeting mine, and then darting away as though afraid I would see too much. I thought I'd try the new cafe, she said, voice tentative, almost playful. Maybe it'll help me forget I have a life outside this corner. She laughed softly, but it sounded brittle, the kind of laugh that only partially masks anxiety. I didn't comment on it. I didn't need to. I simply gestured to the seat across from me, letting her take her time, letting her choose the pace of this small interaction. The waiter brought our coffees, and she stirred hers slowly, her gaze fixed somewhere between the window and the table. I sipped mine without speaking, respecting the silence as a shared presence rather than. When she finally spoke, it was about nothing and everything all at once. How the cafe burned the edge of the croissants too dark, how the barista seemed distracted, how a pigeon had landed on the awning outside and refused to move. Her words weren't really about these things. They were about revealing herself, piece by piece, in a landscape that felt ordinary enough not to demand perfection. I don't usually do this, she admitted, a flicker of vulnerability. Meeting someone for no reason, just existing in the same room. She looked down at her cup, twisting it slightly in her hands. I'm not good at normal. You're not bad at it, I said, letting my tone carry calm certainty. Normal isn't about being perfect, it's about being present. And you're here, aren't you? Her eyes met mine then, briefly, and I saw something shift, a recognition that presence alone could matter more than anything. She smiled, small but genuine, and I realized that ordinary moments like this were building a foundation she hadn't expected, a quiet reassurance that no one was keeping score. We left the cafe eventually, strolling along the streets without any particular destination. She talked in fragments, her words punctuated by pauses and glances around the city, and I listened. I asked questions sparingly, letting her guide the conversation, letting her decide how much to share. Sometimes the simplest exchanges carried the deepest meaning. The way she noted the smell of rain on asphalt, the way she hesitated before stepping over a puddle, the way she let herself laugh quietly at something trivial. By the time we parted, there was no declaration, no promises. Only a subtle change in the way she looked at me, a soft acknowledgement that something had begun. She wasn't fully ready to say it aloud, and I didn't need her to. What mattered was that she allowed me to exist in her world, however small the space, and that she had begun to trust that I would stay. She invited me over one evening with little explanation, almost casually, as if it were no more than a favor or a small task. "Could you help me move some boxes?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. It wasn't about the chore. It was about being present, about showing that I would arrive when she asked, quietly, without fanfare. Her apartment smelled faintly of cleaning detergent mixed with old books. The living room was cluttered but not chaotic, more like a map of her life that had yet to be fully organized. She moved around with careful deliberation, pausing to adjust something here, push a box there, and I followed, silently noting her gestures, the way she navigated her own space, the way her expression softened when she realized she didn't have to do everything alone. "This one's heavy," she said, tilting a box slightly. I stepped forward and lifted it without comment, letting the weight settle between us naturally. She watched, not with surprise but with a quiet acknowledgement that someone could be present without demanding anything in return. We worked in silence more than we spoke. She would occasionally mutter about a book, a forgotten notebook, a photograph tucked between papers, and I would nod, or adjust something, or simply listen. There was no hurry, no expectation of completion, just the rhythm of shared effort, the kind that slowly builds trust in small, unremarkable ways. At one point, she paused, leaning against a table with a sigh. "I'm not sure why I let anyone in here," she admitted quietly. "I like my space, my control. It's easier to manage alone." Her eyes avoided mine, scanning the shelves instead, betraying a vulnerability she rarely allowed. "You don't have to explain," I said softly. "You invited me. That's enough. I'm not here to judge or rearrange your life, only to help with what you asked." Her gaze flickered to mine briefly, an unspoken appreciation passing between us. I could sense the subtle shift, the easing of walls she had built around herself. She wasn't surrendering control. She was simply allowing someone to exist alongside her in a shared moment, proving that presence didn't always demand surrender. Later, after we had stacked the final boxes, she offered me a chair near the window. The city lights reflected softly on the glass, and she leaned back, finally relaxing. I stayed nearby, not intruding, just existing in the same space. The ordinary domesticity, the small gestures of carrying, adjusting, and pausing, created an intimacy that didn't need labels. She glanced at me after a long silence, a faint smile tugging at lips. "Thanks," she said simply, "for just being here." "It's nothing," I replied, though in my mind, it was everything. Presence, attention, quiet commitment, these were the things that mattered. And for the first time, I felt the subtle weight of trust building between us, steady, patient, and entirely unspoken. She began to call me by my full name in a way that felt deliberate, as though she were testing whether using it aloud made me more real, more present. "Alexander," she said softly, almost in passing, while recounting a story about her day. It caught me off guard, not because I hadn't told her my name, but because the weight of hearing it from her lips carried an intimacy that words alone could not convey. We were sitting on the worn leather couch in her apartment, the boxes from the other night still stacked neatly in a corner. She had poured tea for both of us, the steam curling faintly in the dim light. I accepted the cup silently, noticing how she positioned herself across from me, shoulders slightly tense, as if preparing herself to measure the conversation. "I don't usually tell people my full story," she admitted quietly. Her gaze rested on the rim of her cup, tracing the reflections of the ceiling light in the liquid. "Most people don't listen. If they do, they forget it the second they leave." "I remember things," I said, not boastfully, not trying to reassure her with empty words, just a simple statement of fact. Not because I have to, not because I need to, but because I notice. That's all I'm offering. Her hands tightened slightly around the cup, and for a moment I thought she might withdraw, but instead, she leaned forward, her elbows resting on her. "It's strange. I don't know why, but with you, I feel like I can speak without it being dangerous." "It's not dangerous," I said. "You don't have to hide when we're together. You can take the time to be yourself, even if it's cautious or slow." She glanced at me, and there was that flicker again, the one that hinted at trust beginning to root itself in places she thought barren. I didn't press further. I didn't ask her to define it or justify it. Silence can be as meaningful as words, and I stayed quiet, letting her process, letting the moment. We talked about trivial things for the next hour: the weather, a show she liked, a book she wanted to finish. Each fragment of conversation felt like a deliberate step, a thread weaving between us. There were no declarations, no promises, only acknowledgement. She was choosing to let me in incrementally, naming me aloud, letting the ordinary become significant. When she finally rested back against the couch, her posture softened in a way that felt unintentional yet honest. She smiled faintly, a small gesture that carried weight beyond the simplicity of Alexander, she said again, almost shyly. I don't think I've ever used anyone's name like this before. Not with someone I trust. I met her gaze steadily. Then keep using it, I said quietly. Say it as often as you. It won't change anything about me, except to remind me that I'm here, and that you're here too. Her eyes lingered on mine, and I felt that subtle acknowledgement once more. The fragile understanding that presence and patience could create intimacy without demand, that trust could begin with something as simple as the rain had started softly that evening, tapping against the window pane in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. We were sitting together on the couch, not speaking, the only sound the faint patter of water outside. She leaned slightly against me, and I didn't move. I didn't offer words, because sometimes silence speaks louder than conversation, and this silence was full of meaning. I could feel the tension in her shoulders, slowly the slight tremble in her hands disappearing as she settled into the space beside me. There was no urgency in my presence, no expectation of confession or explanation. I simply existed, allowing her the quiet reassurance that someone could be near, without pressing for more than what was given. She shifted, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. I felt her warmth, not as possession, not as desire, but as trust, subtle and fragile. She didn't speak, and I didn't ask her to. Some connections didn't need words to convey their depth. The rhythm of our breathing, the shared space, the gentle weight of presence, all of it created a conversation that was both intimate and unforced. After a while, she whispered, almost hesitantly, I don't usually let people get this close. Her voice carried a mixture of vulnerability and a quiet acknowledgement of the trust being extended. You don't have to, I said softly. You can choose how close or far. I'll respect that. Her hand brushed against mine briefly, accidental, fleeting, but the contact lingered, resonating in the stillness. She exhaled slowly, the faintest smile touching her lips. It was small, but it carried more weight than any dramatic gesture ever could. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a table lamp. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and unrelenting, a gentle counterpoint to the quiet intimacy inside. I noticed the way her eyes tracked the drops on the glass, the slight tilt of her head, the relaxed position of her legs. Each small movement spoke volume, an unspoken language of trust and tentative comfort. We remained like that for hours, sharing space without speaking, communicating through presence and small gestures rather than. It was a kind of intimacy that didn't demand anything but mutual recognition, a quiet understanding that being near one another could be. When she finally shifted to sit upright, brushing her hair from her face, she looked at me with an expression that was both grateful and tentative. I think I could get used to this, she said softly. You already are, I replied. Even in silence, you're choosing to be here. That's what matters. And in that moment, with the rain falling outside and the soft glow of light around us, I realized that the simplest gestures, the absence of expectation, the willingness to stay present, could create the strongest bonds. She had been quiet all day, moving through her apartment with a distant look in her eyes. I watched from the kitchen doorway as she packed a small bag, her movements deliberate but slow, weighed down by decisions that had nothing to do with me, yet somehow, they affected the space between us. I think I might take the job, she said finally, voice low and uncertain. She set the bag down on the bed and ran her hands over it, as if trying to smooth out the invisible wrinkles of work. It's in another city, far from here. I don't know if I should. I didn't respond immediately. It wasn't my place to tell her what to do. I didn't need to convince her or sway her with words. Instead, I walked over, standing beside her quietly, and asked the simplest question, do you want to go? Her gaze met mine, startled at first, as though she had expected me to argue, to insist she stay, to make her choice for her. But I didn't. I was steady, calm, present, not demanding, not judging. I simply offered space for her own decision, for her own voice to be heard above the chatter of doubt and fear that had accumulated over years. I think I do, she admitted, almost reluctantly. But it's hard. Leaving means leaving everything familiar. You won't be alone, I said quietly. You can choose this, and I'll be here. That doesn't vanish just because the city changes. She swallowed, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. The bag sat heavy on the bed, but somehow lighter than before. For the first time that evening, she looked at me with something like hope, tentative, but genuine. It wasn't a declaration, not a promise written in grand gestures or dramatic words. It was the recognition that someone could be present without controlling her, that trust could grow without forcing a surrender. We spent the evening talking through small details, the timing, the logistics, the mundane worries that always accompany major decisions, and with each word, I noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. Her posture relaxed, her voice steadied, her eyes were less hesitant. She wasn't being swept along by reassurance. She was discovering the strength in her own choice, supported quietly by my presence. When she finally leaned back on the couch, she exhaled, the faintest relief escaping her lips. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for telling me what to do, but for letting me decide. For staying." I nodded, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'm not going anywhere. You're free to choose, and I'll be here. That's all I need you to." For a long moment, we sat in silence, the ordinary room around us softened by the unspoken trust we shared. No promises, no grand declarations, just the quiet certainty that some choices, when made with care and presence, can mean everything. The city had quieted. Streetlights stretched long shadows across the pavement, and the air smelled faintly of rain, a reminder that even small storms leave traces. Julia and I walked side by side, unhurried, our steps sinking without effort. There was no conversation at first, only the sound of our feet brushing against the worn sidewalks and the occasional distant hum of tires on wet asphalt. At one point, she stopped, turning slightly to face me. "Everyone always leaves," almost like testing the world, her voice carrying the same fragility from that first night in the cafe. Her hands fidgeted in her coat pockets, the movement nervous, but familiar. I smiled faintly, steady and calm. "I haven't," I said. "I'm not everyone." Her eyes met mine, searching for something she couldn't name, and for a moment, I thought she might retreat, doubt creeping in like it had so many times before. But she didn't. Instead, she exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and disbelief settling over her features. The tension that had been a constant presence in her body seemed to loosen slightly. We continued walking, closer now, but still careful, aware of the fragile balance that had developed between us. There were no declarations, no labels, no promises shouted to the night sky, just the rhythm of shared steps, the quiet understanding that presence, patience, and steady attention could create a foundation stronger than words. "I don't know what this is," she admitted softly, voice barely above the whisper of the wind, "but it feels different." "That's enough," I said. "You don't have to define it, you just have to let it exist." She nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't a smile for anyone else, nor was it performative. It was genuine, a recognition that someone could choose to stay, quietly, without demand, without expectation, without the chaos she had grown accustomed to. We found a bench in a small park, the kind with wrought iron arms and wood worn smooth by decades of strangers resting their weight. She sat first, then I joined her, careful not to crowd the space, letting the subtle gravity of proximity do the work words often could not. For a long while, we said nothing, letting the city's quiet embrace us. Finally, she leaned back, her shoulder brushing lightly against mine. "I thought," she began, then paused, sighing softly. "I thought everyone left, but you stayed." "I'm here," I said simply. "I'll stay, not because I have to, but because I choose to." Her eyes lingered on mine, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. There was no need for more. The city stretched around us, vast and unyielding. Yet within the small circle of this bench and these quiet streets, something important had begun. Something that didn't require explanation, only presence, only choice, only the promise of continuity, quiet but undeniable. And in that moment, as the night held us gently, I knew that whatever came next, she had been chosen, and she had chosen me. Not with grand gestures or dramatic vows, but with the simple, enduring certainty of two people deciding to remain.